Well, we've just been kind of introducing ourselves. For those of you who are joining us right, I'll go ahead and, for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and just get us started because we've got a lot of content just to get through, and I don't want to go over an hour. So, hey, Larry, would you pray for us? Just kind of ask the Lord to give us some direction and wisdom.
Sure. I think it might be good. I'm hearing a whole lot of interference. So
Oh, yeah, I'm going to have to, let's see.
I'll mute ourselves when we're not talking.
Yeah, let me watch the participants list, and I'll mute people as need be. Yeah, Howard's in a Starbucks there.
Okay, now we're good.
I think that was it. Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity to be together and to meet new people. And we just thank you for the body of Christ, for the great variety of people that you have called to yourself through the Lord Jesus Christ. And as we spend this time together, I pray that your Holy Spirit will direct us. I pray for Bill as he leads us through the agenda. I pray that he will be clear, and I pray that all of us will understand, and that we'll have a good conversation that will result in much better dissertations and just an increasing awareness of who you are and what you want to do in this world. So we commit this time to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Thanks, Larry. Well, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to get through a lot of content rather quickly today. Let's see. I guess I'll share. Let me just share that screen. I guess we'll share that screen. Okay. All right. Well, I just wrote down some of the issues that I think are issues that I run into all the time on dissertations. So I wanted to just kind of get those on an agenda. Of course, quite open to your thoughts and concerns, but let me just run through a few things here, just by way of introduction. Let's just bring up the, let's see. To see what my screen is doing here. There we go. Are you seeing that Part 2 Final Project Handbook?
Yes.
Okay. We've been doing a lot of revision in the handbook over the last year or two as we've been trying to improve our dissertation process. I would call your attention to just a lot of issues that are in that book. Just by way of introduction, I just highlighted a few issues. You know, at BGU, we have what we call the eight perspectives of transformational leadership. These 8 perspectives appear on all of our syllabi. They are foundational to the school, and so just be aware of those. If you're not on the BGU faculty, you're not as familiar with some of these. It's good just to kind of be familiar with these terms because we really are asking students to at least demonstrate at least one or not, if not all, of those concepts, those perspectives in their final project work. You know, calling-based, incarnational, reflective, servanthood-based, contextual, prophetic, shalom-oriented, global. I'm not going to take the time to go through all those, but they are all different characteristics of leadership as we have seen those characteristics through the years at BGU. Both the DMin and the DTL degrees are professional degree programs. And we just did an ad hoc faculty committee this last year, and we kind of spent a lot of time on that whole issue, on what is a professional degree program. We were talking about that issue in the context of looking at alternative formats for dissertations. We've always had the ability to do dissertations in other alternative formats from a traditional dissertation. So in that context, we, as an ad hoc committee, looked at a lot of websites and what other schools are doing in terms of their professional doctorate programs. I think one of the main characteristics that makes a professional doctoral program unique, even from, say, a traditional PhD, is the emphasis on the application of knowledge to professional practice. And that is a key, I think, for me. We say the BGU final project may be developed in a standardized dissertation format, and we'll look at that in a moment, or and what we came up with in that committee that we've been using, we were calling it a portfolio approach. In the past, we've had the term alternative dissertation approach, but we've decided we're going to start using the term portfolio approach, which seems to be a term that's being used by quite a few schools. Portfolio, just as the name implies, say a person does a resume and they submit a portfolio of the kind of work that they've done. That portfolio might include journal articles. It might include outlines of projects that they've directed or implemented. It might contain research that they've done. It could contain, a lot of different types of material. It could contain a book that someone has written. And so when we use that term portfolio approach, we're using that intentionally to include a variety of formats that might be addressed by a dissertation. No matter what the approach, though, whether it's a formal dissertation format or using a portfolio approach, we still need to have some common features that are contained in a dissertation. There's always going to be that identifying of a problem that requires leadership within a given context. And of course, the professional degree program also emphasizes problem solving, okay, decision making and problem solving. And so when we look at a dissertation, we are looking at it in the context of solving problems that may be encountered in professional practice, whether that may be, in church ministry, organizational leadership, community leadership, or what have you. Every dissertation project must contain a review of literature that is related to that project. Every research project is also going to contain the collection of empirical data, okay, that is related to the problem. Okay, and then every dissertation project at BGU is going to include an intervention strategy, a transformation strategy. That strategy in a portfolio may have several expressions. Another term that we emphasize here is that students are scholar practitioners. And that idea, the idea of that is that, it says right above there, that BGU programs focus on training of practitioners, leaders who apply principles that will change organizations, communities, even cultures for the better. Okay, and because the BGU does not consider research methods as the end in themselves, instead those methods must undergird actions that transform. So a scholar practitioner is one who is involved in some type of professional practice. Like we said, it might be church ministry, organizational leadership, community leadership. But in the dissertation process, at the professional level, that student is studying principles, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and then applying those principles to a particular context, a particular problem situation, okay? And so a scholar practitioner is a practitioner, a professional practitioner, but at the scholarly level, we are trying to train ourselves as faculty and students to be excellent critical thinkers, that we are using a systematic approach to whatever we are dealing with. And so we're training students in those kinds of skills. Any comments or questions on that at this point in time?
Yeah, Bill, this is Larry.
Go ahead.
I really totally agree with that scholar practitioner comment that you made. A question that has come up. I know some years ago we used to talk about actually doing a project as a result of the project being the paper, but then I'm using the project in a different way here. Are we still requiring that, or just coming up with a strategy, or will the strategy actually have to be implemented within the context of the dissertation? I hope I made that clear.
Yeah, I've wrestled with that very issue in some oral reviews. I've wrestled with some other faculty on that matter. From my perspective, I think that a transformational strategy needs to be developed and tested. Now, that doesn't mean that that transformational strategy is expected to solve the problems. You know, Claire and I have talked a lot about that issue in the research course, that, you know, transformation is a process, and a student may come to the dissertation with a whole transformational process in mind before they've even done the research, okay? So we really are not just encouraging, we're requiring that a strategy grow out of the research. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But from my perspective, some type of a transformational strategy, at least the beginning parts of that, need to have been developed and launched so that there is some testing going on. For me, that has always been a part of the BGU value system, that we are looking at strategies and beginning to test them in a real situation. Others can jump in with your thoughts on that issue.
So, for example, it could be a seminar that they would conduct using the strategy that they have developed in the research.
Exactly. There's going to be exceptions. I know one of our students right now, Courtney Faulkner, he's working in Jamaica, but he's working in the chaplaincy programs of the Jamaican service. He's outlined a whole process to improve the chaplaincy service and how they relate to the people within the service. Due to the kind of administrative structure that he works in, he is not able to implement that whole structure because there is so much red tape that he must go through. But what he's done, he has developed a whole strategy, a whole approach, and he's taking that to some of the relevant leaders of the chaplaincy programs, and he's getting a sign-off on that. And so at this point, he's not able to actually implement that whole program, but, you know, I've said I understand the situation, so there's going to be exceptions, okay? But at least what he's doing by having developed that process and bringing other leaders within the chaplaincy into that process, and they're thinking about that, they're evaluating it, and it's beginning, and that's transformational in itself. It's taking a whole new approach and getting other leaders involved in evaluating that approach, and then working out a timeline where that approach can be implemented. But generally speaking, I would like to see, as much as possible, at least some beginning pieces of that strategy implemented and tested and receive evaluation from people who participate in that strategy.
Good.
All right. Others, questions, and we'll move on. I do want to call your attention to this timeline that is put into the dissertation handbook every year. We're 2019, 2020. So where we're at now is the next deadline is September 8th, which students should have chapter 1 to you as a final project supervisor. You would then be expected to give your feedback, comments, improvements for that chapter. And then October 13th is the next deadline, submitting chapters 2 and 3. So we are in the writing phase now at this point, and the implementation phase of the research. Okay, and so I would remind you to look at this timetable occasionally in the handbook, and you can get the handbook on our website. There's a section called Students. And then I think it's documents or something like that. If you look at the website, you'll be able to get this handbook and find this timeline. Anything else I want to bring to your mind here? I think we've already talked about, yeah, just some of the basic project components. I think we've already kind of talked about that. What we did this last year, we put what we call demonstrated knowledge and skills of all final projects. As this little ad hoc committee that met, we were trying to, as opposed to laying out, say, what an alternative dissertation looks like, we decided we would put down a set of characteristics in terms of knowledge and skills that every dissertation needs to demonstrate, whether they're doing a traditional format or they're using a portfolio approach. And so, you know, we've worked through this as a committee and decided what we thought were some of the key elements in terms of knowledge being demonstrated and skills. And so, you know, these are the same kinds of characteristics that are asked of us, say, of accreditation. Every course needs to, we need to indicate when we have course objectives, learning objectives. We're doing that in the terms of knowledge gained and skills gained. And of course, at BGU, we also talk about the spiritual dimensions that are being formed in a person's life based on a course or a dissertation. So again, I would call your attention to these that you should be kind of becoming familiar with in the handbook. Just to point out one other area here, I'm going to go to the appendix of this handbook for a moment. Down here in the appendix of the handbook are some of the, let me get back to the beginning of this appendix. Let's see, final project proposal. Okay, yeah, Appendix E. This is an outline of what a proposal would look like. Now, I think most of your students will have already submitted a proposal and it's been accepted. At least they're going to be, if they're going to be graduating in June 2020, that proposal has to have already gone to the academic cabinet, and we will have had to approved it and given our recommendations. But anyway, you can find, you know, all the pieces of a proposal that are in that appendix. This Appendix F, information for a standard 5-chapter final project format. Those of you who have been around BGU for a while know that in the past we've used a 7-chapter dissertation. Here in this last year and a half, we've gone to a 5-chapter format, which seems to be a little more in line with what other schools do. But anyway, the typical, you know, you're looking at these in the dissertations right now. The chapter 1 is the introduction, where the problem is you know, defined, the purpose, all these different pieces. researchers' assumptions, definitions, stakeholders. So all that is chapter 1. In the previous 7-chapter dissertation, we had the context of the problem in a separate chapter. But those of us who have been working with this process for some time now, we really felt it was more appropriate to talk about the context in the introduction chapter, which seems to be fairly typical of most schools in their dissertation. The context is, the environment in which this the problem is being addressed. Chapter 2, the literature review, and we'll talk about that a little, some of the issues that come up there, but a traditional literature review. Chapter 3 then is and let me make one other comment. The previous 7-chapter dissertation, we had a separate chapter for the theology reflection section. Again, we've put that theological foundations, reflections into the literature review chapter. The reason being is that we now look at that literature review chapter as discussing the various broad concepts of a theoretical framework, okay? And I think most of you are familiar with that term, either theoretical framework or conceptual framework, or some of the terms that are often used in the dissertation literature. Simply stated, the theoretical or the conceptual framework for a dissertation consists of the various, the word is used often, theories. I don't like that term because as I've looked at Webster's definitions, it's very interesting that the word theory can have 2 opposite definitions. A theory can be a set of propositions, principles that have not been proven, but have been stated. Darwin's theory of Einstein's theory of relativity, or Darwin's theory of evolution. Those are theories. Whether they can actually have been proven or not, it depends on who you're reading, okay? So a theory could be a set of principles, constructs, etc., that have been organized in some kind of a systematic form, but have not necessarily been proven. Generally, in dissertation literature, though, the term theory is used to represent a collection of principles, constructs, etc., that have been analyzed, have been at least given pretty strong evidence through various empirical studies. And so the term theory in relationship to a dissertation is just that. It's a set of principles, constructs, what have you, that have some demonstrated evidence that have been worked through in relation to that. Some of the kinds of concepts, we'll use the term theory cautiously, but the kind of concepts that you're probably familiar with at BGU, theology of work, for example, is a whole set of principles related to what those of us who have studied that, and Larry has kind of focused on that quite a bit, but it's what some have seen as the Bible, what principles of work seems to be discussed and talked about within a biblical context. AI, appreciative inquiry, a whole set of principles and approaches that are used in work organizations. We have ABCD, asset-based community development. Again, that's a set of principles, theories that have been used by practitioners in various communities to bring transformation. But the concepts are just that. It's those big sets of principles that a student is analyzing, defining, discussing, and then applying to a particular problem. The literature review should be organized so that it shows the reader a somewhat of an in-depth discussion on the components of those various concepts or theories that are germane to that student's project. So I'm looking for that all the time starting the research class, that a student is organizing the literature review based on the set of theories, principles, constructs, whatever term you want to use there, that shows that student has researched those concepts and is then giving the reader a sense of what those concepts are. Any thoughts or questions on that issue? The theoretical framework, literature review. Okay, let's keep going. Chapter 3 of the dissertation, of course, is the actual research methodology, the project design.
Sorry to interrupt them. This is Dwight Mtonono, and I was on mute, so I couldn't speak to you then.
Okay.
Yeah, but
you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question on the. See, I'm supervising a student who's done quite a lot of work already on the seven chapter format. And should we change it now to a 5 chapter format, or because I think he's almost done. We're having to fix a few things. It's a lot of I'm working with him and I'm trying to fix a lot of stuff that's in there. But I'm wondering if we go right back again to change it into a 5 chapter rather than a 7 chapter.
Yeah, no, definitely not. Thanks, Dwight. That's a good question. Yeah, and I've dealt with a few students on that issue. If they started their dissertation, with the 7 chapter format, then they are, it's fine to go ahead and continue that process, okay? The way we have it stated in the handbook is dissertations that start after July 1, 2019 do need to use the 5 chapter format, okay? One of the things I would do, though, and we've been kind of in a process for the last couple of years of trying to strengthen the research component in our dissertations. I think BGU has always been very good at the transformational strategy. That's been a hallmark of our program. I don't know that we've been as strong on the research component, and as we've brought on a few other faculty people, I think we are getting stronger in that area. And so as you're looking at just some of the issues here in the handbook, you might at least want to look at the research chapter and make sure the student has addressed these issues, in a fairly good way.
Okay. Even
the term theoretical framework, I don't know that we've actually used that terminology in the past. I've just started using that in the last few years in the research methodology class. I think in the past, it's sort of implied, okay, we're using, various practitioner approaches, theology of work, AI, appreciative inquiry, asset-based community development, etc. But I don't know that we've had actually systematically spelled that out as a theoretical framework for a dissertation. And so you may not see that spelled out quite as well in some of the earlier dissertations. So, and I would not expect you to really have your student make that quite as clear. So we are kind of allowing a little bit of flexibility on some of those who have not come through some of the recent research methodology classes in the last couple of years.
All right, thank you.
All right, look through that research methodology. One of the issues that I often see is that in the research methodology section, they need to describe the research used for the project, qualitative, quantitative mix, etc., and provide a convincing rationale for why you use this design. We want students to be thinking about why they've chosen a particular research methodology. Why is it appropriate to their particular research task? And so we want to see that. We don't want them to just say, well, I used a qualitative approach and then go on from there. No, we want the student to tell us why they thought the qualitative approach was best suited to what they were trying to discover through their research process. Okay, we know quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. A quantitative approach very often is going to involve more closed-ended questions. The purpose is to possibly, for example, determine some of the predominant opinions on a particular topic in a particular population. We may put out a survey with closed-ended questions. We want to have a representative sample of that population, and I give the students a website that they can go to, that they can enter a population size, a coefficient, an efficiency coefficient, and a few other factors, and it will then return what would be an adequate sample. Okay, and that would be especially true if a person is looking for, say, a quantitative approach. And a qualitative approach, of course, then maybe isn't going to have quite as large a sample, but there's going to be more in-depth kinds of research techniques, focus groups, interviews. And there again, the task maybe is a little different. If I want to understand a little more in depth what's going on in a particular population, on how a population feels about a particular problem, what kinds of solutions maybe they are thinking about, I'm probably going to enter into a qualitative approach. And then we have mixtures of those two approaches, and we talk a lot about that. I think the main issue, though, for you as a supervisor, you need to just make sure that your student is adequately describing a rationale for why he or she has chosen that particular methodology and why it is best suited to their particular project. Questions or thoughts on that issue? Okay. Sampling, again, in data collection, you can look at those. Again, we talk to our students about different kinds of sampling approaches. There's purposive samples where, we purposely begin to put together a sample, and then there's kind of a non-purpose, more of a random sampling, which we don't usually use quite as often in most of our dissertations. Data collection, again, we want a section that talks about what kinds of data collection processes are going to be used. And again, we want rationales for each one of those processes. Why is a focus group the best suited research data collection technique that I think, why do I think it's most appropriate for what I'm trying to do in this particular project? The last few years, we've really had to start emphasizing this ethical considerations area. We now have an institutional review board, an IRB, that looks at any proposal that where the research is going to involve. There's two categories that the Department of Health and Human Services here in the United States define. One is vulnerable populations. And that includes just quite a few different people groups, whether they are people who are financially challenged, physically challenged, emotionally challenged, intellectually challenged. It's a fairly broad set of categories. Women, children, pregnant women, minors, those are vulnerable kinds of populations, not just women in general, but they specifically say pregnant women is a vulnerable population. Children. We're going to be looking at proposals very closely if they involve those kinds of populations. Also, the other big category is sensitive topics. When we, and of course, for our purposes, DHHS defines religion as a sensitive topic. So if a student asks anything of a spiritual nature, it's actually considered a sensitive topic. And it needs to then come under IRB, Institutional Review Board review. This review board has just kind of been formed over the last 2 years. We came to the realization that we did need that review board. We didn't really feel like we needed that in the past, but since we accept student loan funds, that makes us liable to some of these institutional review board kinds of issues, and that's really how that ended up becoming an issue for us. I already talked about this transformational strategy, but I think as previously indicated, the transformational strategy should emerge from the research data you collect, indicate how your research supports your transformational strategy, then provide a description of the transformational strategy that you conducted. The actual results of this strategy are to be reported in Chapter 4. That's sometimes an issue. Chapter 3, which we've been looking at here, is the research methodology, okay? Say the transformational strategy, there maybe is a brief description of that transformational strategy here because it's part of the project methodology, okay? The results of that transformational strategy, even just as the results of the research, are actually discussed in Chapter 4, the results. And that's sometimes difficult for students. Trying to define, make sure you get the right content in the right chapter. Chapter 3 is more of a descriptive, has descriptive sections of the research rationales, methodologies, sampling methods, the transformational strategy, evaluation strategies, ethical considerations. Chapter 4, though, is where the actual results of implementing those various strategies are reported on. Here again, in Chapter 4, the student is expected to use charts, graphs, tables to clearly present to the reader the data that has been collected and analyzed. If I look at a results chapter and I do not see some of those kinds of user-friendly components, I will probably question that chapter. We now have, in the last several years, there's something called a word cloud. That's actually a way of demonstrating data. If you're not familiar with word clouds, you can kind of look those up, and you've seen them. You'll have a big cloud looking kind of graphic, and say you were looking at a particular population. What are some of the key words that come out as, say, you do an evaluation, you do a survey, do an interviews with that population? Say a key word is poverty. Or say a key word is gender equality. Say a key word is whatever it happens to be. A word cloud, the words, the concepts that seem to have the most attention are bigger in the diagram. The words that maybe have a little lesser significance, they become smaller. So, that's kind of one of the more recent display techniques to portray the significance of data. But anyway, in the results chapter, we're looking for a good display of the data, and not only then a good display, but a good analysis, talking about so what? What exactly what have you discovered through that data? How does that data, your interpretation of that data, how does it relate to the problem you're addressing and the purpose that you're trying to accomplish? We want to see that, that analysis. And then that, as I've already said, that data, that research and the analysis of it should then logically lead to the formation of some type of a beginning transformational strategy. And so we definitely want to see that. Evaluation sections, we want to make sure that is clear in that findings chapter. Evaluation generally deals with issues with how do you know that your data is valid? inaccurate. We kind of use a term like, say, triangulation, whereby we collect data through a few different strategies. Possibly we do a focus group and we do personal interviews, or we do a survey. How does the data seem to, how does it correlate? Do you seem to be getting similar answers as you look at the various ways that that data was collected? So again, that would be fitting into an evaluation discussion. Likewise, the transformation strategy should have some kind of an evaluative process so that the student is able to see what results, what effects has that transformational strategy begun to produce in relationship to the problem being addressed and the purposes and the goals of this project. One thing I forgot to mention back here in the research methodology section, and actually in the introduction, the last few years, we've also started emphasizing research questions. Those research questions will appear in the first chapter. And those research questions, as we tell students, basically are asking the big questions that student is trying to answer through the research, okay? They shouldn't be yes/no questions. They should be content-rich questions, if we use that terminology. It's what is the empirical research intended to determine? And so you can go back and look at some of those research questions, and we talk about that later. This whole thing ends with a discussion chapter. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. One thing that we are sometimes missing, and we sometimes call students out on, is discuss recommendations based on what you've learned through this process. Also indicate future action steps needed to continue the work begun through the project. Sometimes students will just kind of close out the chapter in that discussion chapter in kind of a weak manner. Well, you know, I think we need to be doing this, and I think we need to be doing that. No, we want that dissertation to end with some strong action steps. What's going to happen after this dissertation process is completed? Where does the process go from here so that transformational process can move forward? And we want some specific deadline dates would be even helpful. Target dates that a student is looking toward to begin to do other phases of what has possibly been begun in this dissertation process. So that's sometimes a weak area that I'm seeing. One other area I think I'm left out. Let's see, is it back here? There, it's right there. No, that's not the one I'm looking for. It's under context. There it is, right here. I was just looking at several proposals that even just came to us and we approved as an academic cabinet. Even though we emphasize the need to describe the worldview of a particular population that student is working with, I'm still not finding a lot of students including an adequate description. And I'm saying, and Martine, I think, has brought this forth very strongly, and it's really helped me just to see that if a person is not understanding the worldview of the people that are being worked with, we're going to make a lot of mistakes, okay? 10 years ago, I worked with the University of Montana, and I worked with a department called AIDTAC. It was Aid to Native Americans with Disabilities. And one of my responsibilities was working with Social Security workers, coordinators, who had to coordinate benefits for Native Americans who had disabilities. My job was to bring in speakers. We did phone conferences. I brought in speakers who would talk about various traditions, say let's say an Alaskan native. There are certain family traditions that Social Security worker needed to be aware of if he or she wasn't going to make some grave errors in the way they handled situations. I remember one situation, some of these Social Security workers couldn't understand that when they wanted to do a counseling session with the person that they were to deal with, why that person would possibly bring 10 or 15 more family members into the counseling session. It caused quite a bit of havoc. But a tradition within that Alaskan Native tradition is that you don't make major decisions without the counsel of your family members. It was very important for Social Security workers to know that issue if they were going to be doing effective counseling with those Alaskan Native Americans. Worldview is very important for our students, and I know I'm going to be emphasizing that even more strongly. And even as I look at what I've just given an example, when I had to do that kind of work with the Native Americans with disabilities and the Social Security workers, that worldview is all important if this dissertation process is going to be successful. Comments on that? Okay. Well, that's the handbook. Just see if there's anything else I left off.
And I still owe you, Bill, I still owe you the list of revised faculty, and I'm planning to work on that this weekend.
That's right.
Finally.
Great. Yeah.
My apologies, I'm a bit overloaded right now.
Yeah, there is a handbook on the website right now. Since we've gone through some administrative role changes over the last couple of months, the staff listing was not accurate in the handbook, so we will get that accurate. But the handbook, the most revised, most recent version of this handbook is on the website. We just loaded that last week, even though we don't have the full staff list. But everything related to the this dissertation process is current in that handbook as far as I know.
Yeah, and so Dr. Judy Melton is the graduation coordinator and coordinates all the practicalities of or the administrative part of dissertations, right? And tracks the students towards graduation. I'm also functioning as a registrar, interim registrar, whatever, but anything that relates like to coursework and admin stuff, even for dissertations, I will help with that, as well as the academic deans thing.
All right, good. I just want to see if I covered all my points that I had talked about. You know, narrowing the focus, problem, the purpose statement. That's sometimes an issue. I was going to go over some examples, but I don't want to take the time to do that. But sometimes I'll see students, they'll start their problem statement in a very vague kind of manner. When I look at a problem statement, I want to see a concise statement to tell me what exactly is the problem issue that is being addressed in this project. Go ahead.
I mean, before your time, when I was, I don't remember what the name of the coordinator that was before your time, Bill, but he told us, put it less than 20 words.
You're right.
And that really has to make it concise.
Right, yeah, that's very good. One of the other issues, we want to make sure that, making sure we document, a student is documenting all their claims rather than just stating personal opinions. Too often I see students just doing that. I was just looking at a person, this person said, you know, from my perspective, I see such and such happening in this organization, and I think this is a problem. But then they didn't say anything more about it. I'm looking for some documentation, what others have seen in relationship to that particular issue, to even see if that is really a valid problem to even be addressed in this dissertation. We've talked about worldviews. We've talked about the theoretical concept, researching sources appropriate to the doctoral level scholar. That's another issue I think I'm going to mention. I think as Claire and I have been working in the research methodology class, we find students too often just kind of giving us a series of websites that have popular articles. There might be a few of those if they really are really germane to the issue, but some of the major categories of literature I'm looking for, there's going to be concept papers. A concept paper simply is giving some kind of a description of the theoretical conceptual framework or the practitioner approaches. And that's fine. We can have some of those kinds of conceptual papers, articles, chapters in books. One of the issues that many of our students have not been as good at is empirical studies. And Claire has really been emphasizing this issue in our research methodology. Empirical studies are involving, collections and analysis of data on a topic. Okay, we are trying to have students, use Google Books since it's easy to get to. We've also have ProQuest in our own library, but we're trying to get students to include a good representation of empirical studies on the topics, and they're there, so that that dissertation will include what other researchers have done, and the reader can see empirical studies that have addressed that issue. There's going to be organizational reports, for-profit, non-profit educational institutions. Those are going to be fine. There's going to be governmental reports. Those are going to be fine. Other dissertations, academic papers. Like I said here, though, too often students, they also depend too often on secondary sources and popular internet articles. We're trying to help students learn not to fall into the trap of just repeating what another person is saying who is repeating somebody else. I've found a few sources recently that help students actually get at primary sources. I've got a friend who is in the history field, and he's directed me to some sources that are very helpful at finding primary sources. Our students are very weak at that issue, and so we'll start looking at that. Also, a good representation of literature from the student's context. We've been emphasizing that issue quite a bit in the last couple of years. We realize there are times that there's going to be sort of a scarcity of literature possibly on a topic within, say, a Jamaican, well, I'm not going to say the Jamaican context, but some of the context. Well, I said Jamaica because I had a student tell me that, well, I just can't find anything on that topic. I think both Claire and I, with a student, directed them to some, studies on Google Books and ProQuest. There were more studies than could possibly even be looked at from Jamaican related authors. Sometimes students just don't realize that there are people within their local context that are doing good research, good literature. And we want to help students dig that out and start creating relationships with those kinds of folks within their area. Providing a comprehensive step-by-step description of the research process, making sure that we are getting a step-by-step process. We've already talked about the rationale. We've already talked about using tables, graphs, etc. in the findings chapter. We've already talked about how the research needs to lead into the transformational strategy. And I think we've already talked about next steps in the discussion chapter. It's a lot to take in, I know, in the hour, but I just kind of want to highlight some of the issues that I think we're looking for in the research methodology classes, and then we are going to be looking for when we see dissertations coming our way. We've only got a few more minutes, but I'd really like to hear from you folks. Comments, thoughts.
Bill, this is not what you covered here, but in the evaluation criteria for the final project proposal, which we've recently received, there's a mechanics of writing section in there. I just have a suggestion. Years ago, of course, I taught business writing, and I studied the research on what makes writing readable. I would suggest that we add in a stipulation that these dissertations and the proposals have an average sentence length of between 15 and 20 words per sentence. That is such a critical element in readable writing. That's not to say that every sentence has to march across the page at 15 words.
Right.
You can have some 30-word sentences, but also some 5-word sentences. You know, you're looking at the average. So just a suggestion that we incorporate readability as part of the criteria.
Yeah, great thought, Larry. Yeah. Yeah, we do try to emphasize for students to write concisely. Too often we see students kind of going off into some flowery poetic language. They kind of feel like they're trying to write a popular book, and we say, you know, that's not what a dissertation writing is all about. Sometimes dissertation writing doesn't have to be totally dry, okay? But it does have to be concise. And I know, like you said, even using concise sentences. You know, I tell students, don't use Pauline sentences when you go through some of the letters of Paul. Sometimes you have to go back several paragraphs to see what the thought was that he started. But yeah, we don't want to see that kind of writing in a dissertation.
And the reason for a measurement is concise can mean one thing to you and another thing to me.
Exactly.
Whereas if we put an actual measurement in there, and this is based on readability research.
Right.
Back in like 1950, 1960, there were actually people known as readability researchers, and they did magnificent work along this line. So this is a demonstrated fact that sentence length is one of the critical elements in readability. So if we put in an actual standard, you know, between 15 and 20 average, I think that would be really helpful.
Good point. Yeah, I'm just writing that down for my notes. Okay. Other thoughts, questions?
Bill, I had a question.
Go ahead, Ed.
This is my first time advising for BGU. Could you give me an idea of where we fit in terms of, are we one of several readers of the project? Are there other people? For example, I don't consider myself with the formatting being my strength. For instance, I'm looking more at content, and is there somebody else who will also read that for formatting purposes and make sure it's up to the standards, for instance?
Right, that's a good question. Yeah, your role as a supervisor is just that, what you just said, Ed. You're looking at the content. You might see some organizational, so you might be able to organize some content in a little better, more clear format. Not format, but maybe in a sequential order. You might see some things. You should probably talk about this issue before you talk about that issue. But yeah, in terms of content is going to be your focus. A technical reader, I'm going to scan a dissertation because it usually comes to me at different times throughout the process. If I think a dissertation, and you as a supervisor, if you think that dissertation needs a professional editor, I'm going to say that to you, and you need to say that to me. At the BGU level, we have a technical reader who goes through a dissertation in a very detailed manner, looks at all the APA or Turabian formatting, looks at grammar, looks at sentence construction, looks at subject-verb agreement.
Looks at plagiarism.
What's that?
Checks plagiarism.
and looks at plagiarism, that's right, yes. So yeah, we do, that happens at the technical reader level after you've approved it, okay? So we're looking to you as a supervisor to really look at that content.
Thank
and
you.
If you find that a student needs to hire a personal editor, please let us know, Dr. Bill and myself, and we do have a list of potential editors who do that for fee, and that a student can hire privately.
Right. Okay. Anything else for the good of the order? All right. I will be sending you probably a few more emails. You know, I gave you the email that kind of went over chapter 1. I'm going to continue to do that sort of thing. The other thing is I find some time really trying to locate good short videos that we might access online that possibly address a particular aspect of dissertation writing that we think would be helpful to all of us as supervisors. If you run across articles, PowerPoints, videos online, send them my way, and we'll get those up and running.
Bill, could I make one more just comment on the evaluation criteria for the proposals? I found it difficult. For example, the literature review chapter, there were 4 subpoints there, and yet I could only make one mark, you know, on the, well, the excellent, strong, adequate, weak, or inadequate. I could only make one mark, whereas the 4 points, I made, one of them may be really bad and one really good, and I didn't know quite how to average all that in the literature review chapter, for example. So I ran into a snag trying to fill out that evaluation. Just some feedback.
That's a good point, Larry. I mean, I remember you emailed me on that, but I hadn't thought about the idea that maybe that would be the better approach, to go ahead and extend each one of those bullet points out for a checkbox. And I mean, yeah, because you kind of got the linear scale going across from, you know, excellent to, you know, whatever. But I think that maybe that would be helpful. If that would be helpful to others, I'll go ahead and revise that format a little bit. I should mention one other issue, and then we're going to close up shop. But when a student starts the dissertation process, he or she enters into what we call DFP or DIS 701A, 701B. These are courses. They're dissertation writing courses. We have a Populi course actually designated in our online campus for each of those writing courses, 701A, 701B. The idea when we started those was that supervisors would get involved with their students in that course. Most supervisors have found it just as probably easier for the student just to email the dissertation directly for them to look at. And I agree that probably is the easiest. What we have told students is that if they will upload their, say, chapters to that Populi course, there's a plagiarism checker that they can utilize that will actually allow them to see if they inadvertently copied text without putting in quotation marks, or if their summarizing of a author's content was so close that it could be considered plagiarism. We subscribe to something called Unicheck, and we have that incorporated into Populi. I'll probably, as we keep working on that course, frankly, I just have not had the time to work on that course. I really would like to see that course developed. There's the possibility some other courses have been being developed lately. I know Claire has developed a course on focus groups, a 1-credit course. She's developed another one on case studies, and also interviewing. I would really like to see us, utilize some of those courses, even if we use parts of those courses and included them in our one of those Populi dissertation writing courses, that would be great. But that's kind of on the drawing board right now. I know right now you're kind of on your own as a supervisor. I will, like I say, I will send out these letters probably once a quarter as you're dealing with what I would think is the next deadlines coming up. And I'll try to give you, thoughts that I think are important for you to be looking for, say in whatever chapter you're reviewing. But again, my ultimate goal is to begin to, somewhere in the future, to be able to actually utilize those two populi dissertation writing courses to their full extent. Right now, they're almost like placeholders there. But I think we could do a lot with those courses, and you as supervisors could be involved in that process. All right, with that, I don't want to keep you any longer. If you have questions, feel free to give me an email. We're going to be doing our next research course starting October 1. We are going to have one online conference session where I'd like to invite supervisors to come in, just so I can let students see a face and maybe just introduce yourself, so that students at least know some of the supervisors who are working. I've got other potential supervisors out there that I'd like to bring in to at least introduce them in a Zoom room and online conferencing part of our research course, which again will start on October 1. So I will let you know about that sometime in the coming months, coming weeks.
All right. Thank you.
All right. With that, I thank you for making the time. This session has been tape recorded. I will send out a link to the mailing list from which you received your invitation to this session. And if you want to, go back and look at the session, you can. And I know some of the other supervisors want to be able to take a look at it. Again, thanks for joining me. Appreciate your work.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye now.
Bye.